Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of Nint, the Toy Tinker. We left the Boniface Estates on the 1st of May, said Nicodemus. We knew a lot more then when we went in. We had been there for 8 months. Then, said Justin, we found the Toy Tinker. They were back in Nicodemus's office. Mr. Ages, having rested, sat with them. Not quite yet, said Mr. Ages. No, said Nicodemus. That was in the late summer. When we first got out, we began searching for a place to live permanently, or at least a place where we could stay as long as we wanted. We had a pretty clear idea of what we were looking for. We had had plenty of time to talk about it on long winter evenings in the library between reading books. The reading we did. We knew very little about the world, you see, and we were curious. We learned about astronomy, about electricity, biology, mathematics, about music and art, and I even read quite a few books about poetry and got to like it well. But what I liked the best was history. I read about the ancient Egyptians, the Greek, the Romans, the Dark Ages, when the civilizations fell apart and the only people who could read and write were the monks. They lived apart in the monasteries and they led the simplest kind of life. And they studied and they wrote and they grew their own food, built their own houses and furniture. They even made their own tools and their own paper. Reading about that, I began to get some ideas of how we must live. Most of the books were about people. We tried to find some about rats, but there wasn't much. We did find a few things. There were 2 sets of encyclopedias that had sections on rats. From them, we learned that we were about the most hated animal on earth, except for maybe a snake or a germ. This seemed a little strange to us and unjust, especially when we learned that some of our close cousins, like squirrels, for instance, and rabbits, were very well liked. But people think we spread diseases, and I suppose possibly we do, though never intentionally, and surely we never spread as many diseases as people do themselves. Still, it seemed to us that the main reason we were hated must be that we always lived by stealing. From the earliest times, rats lived around the edges of human cities and farms, stowed away on men's ships, gnawed holes in their floor, and stole their food. Sometimes we were accused of biting human children. I don't believe that, nor did any of us, unless it was some kind of subnormal rat bored in the worst of city slums. And that, of course, can happen to people too. Had we then no use at all in the world? One encyclopedia had a sentence of praise for us. The common rat is highly valued as an experimental animal in medical research due to its toughness, intelligence, versatility, and biological similarity to man. We knew quite about that already, since we were experimental animals. But there was one book written by a famous scientist that had a chapter about rats. Millions of years ago, he said that rats seemed to be ahead of all the other animals and seemed to be making a civilization of their own. They were very well organized, built quite complicated villages in the fields. Their descendants today are the rats known as prairie dogs. But somehow it didn't work out. The scientists thought maybe it was because the rats lived there too, while other animals, especially like monkeys, were living in the woods and getting tougher and smarter. The prairie dogs grew soft and lazy, and no more progress was made. Eventually, the monkey came out of the woods, walking on their hind legs, and took over the prairie, almost everything else. It was then that the rats were driven to become scavengers and thieves, living on the fringe of the world run by men. Still, it was interesting to us that for a while at least the rats had been ahead. We wondered if they had stayed ahead, if they had gone on and developed a real civilization, what would it have been like? Would rats too have shed their tails and learned to walk direct? Would they have made tools? Probably, though we thought not so soon and not so many. A rat has a natural set of tools that monkeys lack, sharp pointed teeth that never stop growing. Consider what the beavers can build with no tools, but their rodent teeth. Surely rats would have developed reading and writing and judging by the way we took it. But what about the machines? What about cars and airplanes? Maybe not airplanes. After all, a monkey lived in trees, must have felt a need to fly, must have envied the birds around them. Rats may not have that instinct. In the same way, a rat civilization would probably never have built skyscrapers, since rats prefer to live underground. But think of the endless subway below subway that we could have built. We thought and talked quite a bit about this. And we realized that a rat civilization, if one ever did grow, we realized that a rat civilization, if one or would not necessarily turn out to be anything at all like a human civilization. The fact was that after 8 months at the Boniface estate, none of us was sorry to move out of it. It had given us shelter, free food, and an education, but we were never really comfortable there. Everything in it was designed for animals who looked, moved, and thought differently from the way we did. Also was above ground, and that never quite felt natural to us. So when we left, we decided that our new home should be underground, preferably in a cave. But where? We thought long and hard and studied maps and atlases. There were plenty of those in the study. Finally, we came to some conclusions. To find a cave, we would have to go where there were mountains and there weren't any caves in the flatlands. And for food, it would have to be near a town or better yet, even a farm. So we wanted to find a farm, preferably a big one with a big barn and a silo full of grain, near the mountains. We studied the map some more, and it was Jenner, I think, who spotted this area as a good place to look. On the map, a big part of it covered with contour lines that showed mountains, and across these were written the words Thorn Mountain National Forest. Beneath that, in smaller letters, it said Protected Wilderness Preserve. Bordering this, where the mountains turned to foothills, the map showed rolling country with quite a few roads but hardly any towns, which we thought ought to mean farmland. We were right, of course, you know. It took us 2 months of steady traveling to get to the Thorn Mountain National Forest, but we found it. We're under the edge of it now, and there are plenty of caves, most of them never visited by people because people aren't allowed to drive into the wilderness preserve. There aren't any roads in the forest, but only a few jeep trails used by rangers, and airplanes are not permitted to fly over. We looked at a lot of caves, some big and some small, some dry but mostly damp, before we chose this cave and this farm. However, we found the toy tinker. It began to be a sad sort of thing. We found an old man lying in the woods one morning, near one of the jeep trails, not so far from here. He was dead. We don't know how he died. We guessed it must have been a heart attack. He was dressed in a black suit, old-fashioned in style, but not neat, a little bit ragged. His hair was white and his face looked gentle. I wonder who he is and where he was going, Justin said. Whoever he was, Jenner said, he wasn't supposed to be here at all. We ought to bury him, I said. So we did. Not by digging a grave, but by covering with high mounds of leaves and stone and twigs and earth. It was in a gathering material for his mound that Justin made a second discovery. He was back in the bushes out of sight. Look here, he called. I found a truck. It was a very ancient truck with a small round hood, but it had lovely polish and was very shiny. The body, which was square and large, had been rebuilt and painted red and gold. It was little windows with white curtains, and between them, lettered in gold, were 2 signs. The Toy Tinker. Toys, repairs, hobby kits, model sets, electrical toys, and all work guaranteed. Obviously, the truck had belonged to the old man. He was a peddler and mender of toys. The red and gold wagon was his shop and his home, and he had driven into the woods to camp for the night. It was against the law, of course, so he had concealed the truck behind some of the bushes off the trail underneath a big beech tree. We could see where he had made a campfire, carefully surrounding it with stones and clearing away the brush so that he would not set the woods on fire. Beyond the beech tree, a narrow brook flowed. It was a peaceful spot. We could see what probably caused the old man's death. One wheel of the truck had sunk into the soft earth and was stuck. A shovel lay near it. He was trying to dig it out. The work had been too hard for him, and he started to go for help. Then he collapsed. This much we could figure out just by looking. And then somebody said, "Who does the truck belong to now?" "It belongs to his descendants," I said. "Whoever they are," said Jenner. "He may not have any. He seemed to be a bit alone." "Anyway," said someone else, "how would they ever find it?" "True point," I said. "We don't know who he is, and if we did, we have no way of notifying anyone. So I suppose, if we want it, this truck is ours. Why don't we see what is in it?"